Let me just ask you, because I think this is interesting, especially for people who are maybe not part of the medical community. It became the culture. Pain was the fifth vital sign. People were always asked about pain if they came in, even for a cold, oftentimes walking out with narcotics for seemingly trivial things. Who was driving that? How did that happen? I mean, you know, we want science, we want data, we want, you know, trials to prove things. Those trials didn't exist to show that, you know, these medications could work long term. So how did this happen in your opinion?
Yeah, I think there's so many factors. You know, certainly the licensing of the medicines was based on short-term endpoints, not long-term endpoints that looked at benefit and risk. And a lot of trials don't look at the long term and don't necessarily really try to find the risk, which we've now seen. But there's so many factors. You know, as you mentioned, the fifth vital sign. You know, you're in a hospital. You're being, you know, you're a surgeon. You know this. You're being asked, you know, what's the number of your pain? And clinicians really started to get the idea that they were supposed to get rid of that pain, get it to zero, and that's how they were being evaluated. So we really have a system failure here, where people thought they were doing the right thing, treating the pain, starting medicines that they thought were safe, that turn out not to be safe. And patients, you know, doing what they were told, you know, take this. Lots of little things. You go to the dentist, you get a pain medicine, you get stuff that's stronger than what you need, and you get, you know, a week's supply or a month's supply sometimes. You only probably need a day or two supply. So there are many tiny steps that really got us to this culture where we've been using drugs that are dangerous and have just lost so many lives. You know, it's about over 40 people a day have been dying from overdoses, and quite a lot of them from prescription drugs. We also know that 3 out of 4 heroin addicts started on prescription opiates, and you all have seen the statistics of heroin. The problems are just massive, and now we have fentanyl-laced heroin, which is even worse. So we really, as a public health expert, we look at our national statistics. Almost everything's getting better. Cancer, stroke, you know, almost all of the leading causes of death are getting better. Overdoses are getting worse, and they're getting worse in a very important middle-aged population that really is unintentionally losing their lives.
Josh, you really look at these numbers quite carefully. We're quoting 2014 numbers. A lot of times those are some of the best numbers that we still have or that are still coming in. How are we doing even over the last couple of years? What are you seeing in terms of trends?
So I think it's a very tough overall situation, but I think there are some signs of hope, actually. So we're surveilling a group of several thousand nationally representative community physicians around the country, looking very closely at their prescribing behaviors. And you know, particularly since we're a cloud-based healthcare IT company, we're able to develop very fine-grained information on a very current basis with minimal reporting delay. And just taking 2016, for example, we've seen the proportion of patients amongst our Sentinel group of doctors that are receiving opioid prescriptions drop by about 6.5%. So maybe some of the Center for Disease Control's messaging is having a positive effect. Physicians are prescribing lower doses, so the proportion of high-dose prescriptions has gone down by about 4%. They're being much more vigilant and much more likely to diagnose patients that are addicted to opioids and to treat them with buprenorphine and other effective medications. So the number of patients that are diagnosed and treated is up about 40% since 2014. And then finally, one of the metrics I like to look at is the number of the proportion of opioids prescribed for new cases of pain. So we back out all of the refills, and there I think the news is most encouraging because at least amongst primary care doctors, that rate has declined by about a third in the last 3 years. So a really tough situation, particularly in regard to the kind of tragic volume of overdoses, but I think some signs of improvement. It's not enough, and it's not happening fast enough. But slowly, hopefully, moving in the right direction.
If you're not sure of the answer to this, you can just say you don't know. But when you look at what are some of the primary drivers of even this plateauing or even decreasing over the last couple of years, What is it? Do you think it is some of the guidance from the CDC, or what do you think is really driving that?
Yeah, so we haven't done quantitative analysis on those drivers, but my best guess is that you do have just much better information. I think the mindset of physicians is shifting. There's a lot of legislative and policy innovation on the federal and state front. So lower initial doses, better monitoring to identify drug-seeking patients and things like that. And it's beginning to have an effect. We still haven't addressed some root cause problems. There's some great emerging new therapies. Reimbursement for them is not often satisfactory. Physicians are expected to treat complex patients in 8 to 12-minute visits. You just can't manage complex pain effectively, nor can you effectively address addiction issues in that time frame. So there's still some huge barriers as well.
Sean, I see you nodding your head, and I'm going to ask you about your experience and then also what you did with that in a second. But Bashad, let me ask you first. Opioids are sort of what everyone thinks of with regard to treating pain. I mean, it's opioids. It is literally this poppy plant that we've now been able to synthesize and turn into all these various pills, and that's been around for decades. And sort of a little bit what we're going to be talking about here, there's not a lot new in terms of how we treat pain, seemingly. Why is that? I mean, for epilepsy, we have 7 different generations of epileptic drugs, lots of other neurological disorders. We have all these options. What happened with pain?
I think it's a pretty complicated story, probably mostly related to the fact that people thought that opioids were very effective and that everyone was happy with the results. And there were lots of generics available. They were inexpensive. Today, just as Josh is talking about, not only interventions, but even non-opioid medications that are new. For example, there's IV Tylenol you can use in the hospital. It doesn't get reimbursed because it costs whatever it is, $18 a dose versus 20 cents a dose for morphine. So I think reimbursement has something to do with it. But then there's the fact that if it looks like opioids have this massive market pretty much covered, then most pharmaceutical companies are not going to try to jump in there with a new product that would have to compete. So here we are now with the situation we have. We are in this pickle. We have 2.4 million people who are addicted to opioids, and we also have to deal with them. We have to deal with it from a solution standpoint and to deal with the demand issue we have. There's a lot of action being taken to take care of the supply side. You know, let's try and make sure that physicians are writing fewer prescriptions for opioids. They're going slower. DEA is trying to head off supplies out there wherever they can. But we have a demand issue, which is that there are people who now have had their brain chemistry change, and they are now struggling with the disease of opioid addiction. And on that side, it is also woefully few medications that are available. As you say, in any other therapeutic area, you can count dozens and dozens. There's probably 1,000 medications in clinical trials for any cancer you can pick out. And we have 3 molecules for opioid use disorder. And buprenorphine is one of them, as Josh mentioned. And it doesn't get used as often as it should be. So our vision is to try and change that angle of it to make sure that the people who actually have now gotten to the point where they're suffering from the disease of opioid addiction have solutions that are different than what's available to them now. And to also try and head off the pain side of things by having not this 30-day of oxy that people go home with, but maybe a 3-day shot that they get pre-op, and then that's it. And they wake up, they're okay, and they don't end up having to need any more medication going forward.
You showed me an implant while we were backstage.
Yeah.
What is that implant? How does that work?
This is a buprenorphine implant. It's Probufene. It lasts 6 months. 4 of these get inserted just under the skin in a doctor's office. And they're intended for people who are already doing well on buprenorphine. And our other products are weekly and monthly injectable in clinical trials, investigational. And we're hoping eventually to have this whole range, kind of a continuum of care where patients, depending on where they are in their recovery from opioid addiction, can have something that can't be abused, can't be lost, can't be accidentally taken by a child, and that they can take and kind of feel normal without having to chase what they've been having to use to feel okay.
Howard, when you started thinking about virtual reality, I think many members of the audience may have seen your demonstration yesterday with Ariana. How did that come about for you? What were your hopes with regard to virtual reality and pain?
Well, virtual reality is an experience for people. And, I think all of these solutions are fantastic in finding better ways to administer the drugs. But if you look at the data that we presented, we can have a really dramatic effect without introducing a molecule. And so that kind of begs the question, what's happening for people? That we have, Deepak Chopra comes out and we have a meditative experiences and we all get into a different place. And so I think that as we look at new alternatives and technologies, we have virtual reality that is based in experience. It's a way to create an entire environment for somebody that can be scaffolded and deliver very targeted kinds of results. So over the years, our research has looked at how you magnify that effect and the effect of changing things about the technology and changing things about the experience, and how that changes the sort of outcome for people with pain. The basic premise is that, and Adam Gazzaley pointed this out today, that we are, as animals, we evolve based on our experience of the world, and the environment has a big impact on us. And so we're very excited because what you see is a real change in the brain as a result of changing that environment.
So that's measurable, you're saying. It's not a molecule, it's a virtual reality experience, but you can measure a change in the brain as a result of that?
Yes, and the fMRI data that I showed yesterday kind of indicated what those changes are. But I think that sort of the overall, sort of the pathway that this kind of approach of using digital health and in particular VR, where that leads is a real transition from the patient or the user from a health consumer to a health producer. We want to help that transition, and part of it is that people will assume some responsibility and use these things. We make that as enjoyable and fun and engaging as possible. And they love it. They like to use it, and that is very successful. But we're trying to really sort of shift the focus from administering some sort of pill as a solution to what they can do on their own.
You called it sort of an immunotherapy in some ways, which would suggest that you're sort of immunizing the body in some ways for it. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But Sean, before you talk about specifically what you're working on, just tell us about what happened to you, your experience with pain.
Sure. So when I was in college, about 6-7 years ago, I lived with a really excruciating spine pain. And I went through about 2-3 years of treatment, tried a lot of different things. And during that time, there's a lot of drugs involved. I don't remember my third year of college, just from the Valium, the Vicodin, the gabapentin, just the regimen that I was dealing with. And going through that experience, it was very much about how do I get off the drug, but more so is about how do I find a reliable approach to solving this problem. Because if I get off the drug, that's great, but I'm still in pain, or what am I really going for? I'm going for a reliable approach to treating this problem. And so 2 to 3 years into that experience, I met one of my dad's friends who was a physiatrist, and he had a practice in Cupertino near Apple, and he brought me in and he introduced me to this thing he called a TENS machine. So it's a big ice box, a lot of buttons, wires that came off to these sticky pads, and it was like, I'm going to shock your pain away. It was electrical pulses to the relief, is how he explained it. And I was like, okay, whatever. Just let me see what, I was desperate, And he put the pads on my neck, started pressing a few buttons, and within about 10, 20 seconds, the pain vanished and went away, and it felt really pleasurable. And so I had this experience, I was like, excuse me, but what the fuck was that? What the fuck did you just do? It was very astonishing to experience that, and it was an epiphany of sorts. And I used that treatment. It didn't solve all my problems. It gave me a bridge. It allowed me to manage my pain so I could sleep better, eat better. Over the course of 2-3 months, I started working out. I started hanging out with my friends on the weekends, things I was not doing before. And so through this process, I ended up with about 10% of the pain from where it started. And the question was, why isn't everyone doing this? And so the question for our company has become, over the past 3 years, is what is a reliable approach to creating that outcome? Not only for myself, but for everyone out there that's living with pain. And we've looked at the research, and there's TENS devices. They're out there. They're big and bulky. They've made them small, but they're ineffective when you just hand this Walkman version of this $10,000 device, off to a patient. More importantly, you've seen the industry shape to where you have not just TENS, but spinal cord stimulators that are delivering these really incredible outcomes, 80-90% relief, reductions in pain and opioid use with an implant. And so for us, it's really been about how do you take TENS, something that hasn't been innovated in for the past 20, 30 years, and develop a solution that can reliably solve chronic pain. And it's not about the device only, it's about the plan that the physician has. And the problem right now is they have a plan, they don't have an alternative to the drugs. And so what we developed, essentially, and there's a picture of it, you can show it up on the stage, on the screen somewhere, I guess.
They pull up the picture
It's
of
ready,
it,
but it's essentially it's a wearable version of this idea of a TENS device, but not a traditional TENS device that hasn't changed the last 30 years, but taking the science around neuromodulation, what works, what doesn't work, and applying it into a wearable form factor. And it's designed to achieve, a reliable outcome for patients, but just as important as developing a treatment that can be effective is developing an experience that can be used and prescribed by a physician. And so you develop this patch, you place it on your back, you press a button, and within about 7 seconds, it adjusts the therapy to a level that's suitable for treating back pain.
Did something like this didn't exist? I mean, TENS unit existed, as you mentioned, but not...
Yeah, like you have the back straps, the leg straps. People have commoditized this technology quite a bit, but they've reduced the efficacy of those technologies as they brought them down to that simpler form. And so the question is, how do you deliver that innovative sort of, or the leading technology that's out there in a way that's simple to use, and no one's really achieved that in a way that a physician can say, here you go, and to really replace the drug. It's not just about, oh, it has the buttons, this is how you use it. It's how do I hand this off in a minute, 30 seconds, and have them just walk away with it with a reliable outcome.
I want to take some questions from the audience as well. If we have microphones out there, if you want to just give me a signal, and I'll call on you. But as we wait for that, Dr. Schuchat, when you hear the CDC really focused on prescribing guidelines around opioids, go low, use small doses, all that sort of stuff. When you hear these different sorts of approaches, alternative approaches to opioids, what are your reactions? And what is just, you put your governmental hat on because you got a uniform, so I got to ask you the governmental questions. What is the likelihood of getting these sorts of things approved, getting insurance companies on board, and making it real?
I think there's never been a time where there is such united interest in solving the problem that we have. This is a bipartisan issue right now. People say, we're seeing families all over the country lose loved ones to opioid overdoses, and chronic pain is common. The issue earlier about value-based healthcare is where people are, and we really need to have evidence for the benefits and risks of a number of interventions to treat chronic pain so that we have other approaches. We know now that clinicians can avoid a lot of overprescribing, but we still will be left with chronic pain patients. And I think there is, if you gather the evidence, I think there'll be approvals, and I think insurers will cover things that we know work, especially things that can prevent some of the harms that we've been seeing.
Good question. Yes, please.
Yeah, Steve Miller. What's the data for the abuse deterrent formulations? So this is being pushed by the industry and we know that addicts don't like the abuse deterrent formulations, but is there any data that actually decreases opioid dependency?
My understanding is that there's not data that those are effective. And some of you may know what happened in southeastern Indiana. This is like the saddest thing that's happened in the past few years, but in a small town in Austin, Indiana, abuse deterrent opioids were being injected. They were so concentrated, so high potency that people were sharing needles and injecting those, up to 10 times a day. In that little town, 1 out of 25 of the adults, 4% of adults developed HIV when a person with HIV came into the syringe sharing network. it turned out that 1 out of 5 adults in that town was sharing needles and injecting drugs. And so, the thing I know the most about those abuse deterrent drugs is that it just became a horror in that one town. I think that for the pharmaceutical companies out there, we need good data on benefits and risks, and we need, clinicians need to be following the evidence. We need insurers to reinforce that in terms of what's covered.
So another question over here. Please, if you could please say your name and your organization, if you have.
Hi, Michal Efram with Fortune. So we're sitting here in the state of California where we've had medicinal marijuana available for a while, and we will very likely have recreational availability soon. Can you talk about just the impact there, some of the research, newer research that's being done on marijuana and pain relief? And I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet.
Right. Is this for me? Okay, great. Right. It's like when you're wearing a uniform, you get all the fun questions. I'd just like to say the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, is doing a study to really try to pull together the evidence base about benefits and risks of marijuana, the issues of effect on kids, effect on impaired driving, and so forth. There's a lot of it's such a dynamic period with so many states changing their policies and so many more people changing their practices that we really need to understand the short-term and long-term impacts.
If I can add a little bit, given that the pharma industry obviously has to go through quite rigorous clinical trials and approval process, we agree with most clinicians that for marijuana to be used as a medical substance, it should also go through the same rigorous evidence gathering kinds of trials. And I was actually involved in a previous role with a medicine called Sativex, which is a liquid formulation of THC, and it was tested for chronic pain. It was tested on top of opioids for late-stage cancer pain, and those studies, and it's publicly disclosed, they failed. It might have been very well a clinical trial issue. I'm not saying that it means that there is no efficacy, but that's the route that I think should be followed if we want to make marijuana into a medicine. I have no problem with communities and people deciding what they want to use recreationally per the law, but to use something as a medicine, I think it should actually get developed as such.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if there's other questions, but I want to say something about that as well. I think most people do agree with that. It's seemingly, but it is hard, I think, when a substance is already scheduled in a way that makes it difficult for the clinical research to ever happen. I mean, would you agree with that, Dr. Schuchat? If people want to ensure that they're getting a dose that is reliable, that is consistent, that it is safe in terms of how the substance, if it is natural, was grown, and what the expectations are. But it has been challenging with this particular substance to actually put it through the process that Behshad is describing.
Yeah, I think that having good information is just critical, and having reproducible dose would be helpful for getting good information. But I think that we need to base our clinical decisions on strong evidence, and we need to support that. There are lots of shortcuts to getting things used or marketed that really don't help us in the long run.
Yeah. Are there other questions out here? Let me ask you something, Josh. It's interesting when you look at opioid prescriptions overall. And I remember when we started doing some reporting on this, I was really struck in Washington State. One of the clinicians, an ER clinician, said typically what we're seeing here, the people who are dying from these opioid overdoses are typically more likely to be men. They're more likely to be non-Hispanic Caucasians. They're typically in their mid-30s, and many of them hadn't taken opioids prior to 18 to 24 months before they actually had an opioid overdose death. Is that what you're finding as well? Does this break down in some sort of demographic like that?
Well, we haven't looked at mortality and overdoses. We have looked at potential provider bias, and what we've observed is actually really interesting. So we looked at a group of patients that came for treatment for chronic back pain. And what we found is that primary care physicians were about a third less likely to prescribe opioids to African Americans, a third less likely to prescribe opioids to Hispanics, and about 50% less likely to prescribe opioids to Asians. And so, we also know that I think between about 2000 and 2013, the mortality rate for middle-aged white people increased. It continued to go down in every other advanced country. It continued to go down in minority groups in the United States. And so, one of the additional drivers is the fact that white patients are more likely to receive opioids, and I think in some cases it leads to addiction and leads to overdose. In particular, for patients that have been clean for 12 to 18 months, when they resume taking opioids, they lose their tolerance. So maybe you take opioids for a year or two, it takes more and more to get the desired effect. You go clean, you fall off the wagon, and if you return at your previous dosage, I think it's a lot more dangerous, and that's probably driving some of the fatal overdoses.
So you had a certain tolerance, and then so you're taking escalating doses. You stop for a while, go back to that dose, and that's a typical pattern.
Yep.
Howard, when you hear all these comments and you hear Dr. Schuchat talking specifically about what the approach might be to alternatives and other options with regard to pain, how challenging is it for you and using virtual reality to get this as a viable alternative for pain? What steps do you go through? How do you approach it?
Yes, so we are bringing products out to hospitals, chronic pain clinics right now. And for us, the challenge, we have a lot of good data. There's been, hundreds of published studies. We've got fMRI data. We've got that. But then you look at the change in care, and reimbursement is also an important issue. And on that front, we're actually having a lot of really good discussions, because I agree that this opioid crisis has brought a lot of players together. And I think that this could be one of the places where, as was mentioned before, we need a response that's across industries, across from the payers to the providers to solution providers such as us. And pain is such an immediate thing. It's actually a great place to do work and to try to help people, because you see an immediate change. You don't have to wait 6 months or for a longitudinal study. So we are seeing that kind of adoption. The first adopters are coming in. They're trying it in different contexts with patients. We're having those discussions with providers who are actually really motivated to try to find other alternatives, because they are responding to these calls for different approaches. So from my perspective, we are seeing all of the players come together, and it's just a matter of, pushing it out and really kind of collaborating to get it into use.
But I imagine for someone to get benefit, they would have to, how would it work? If you were to prescribe VR for someone who has chronic pain, would there be a dose? Would you be using the virtual reality a certain amount of time? Do you know the answer to these questions? How do you go about getting those answers?
Well, some of that's very individual. Pain as a general topic is very broad. The pain that you feel from a wound is different than fibromyalgia, and so it starts out being difficult to generalize across all pain. But these experiences are elective. They're non-invasive. They're very low risk, and somebody can use it in their however they deem fit. But in the context where it's being used in, for example, a chronic pain clinic, the patients are so the durations are a 5-minute experience, and they've also tried it in multiple sort of 20-minute experiences. 5 minutes does have a very good effect. They're seeing 60% reductions in pain in that context. And for 3 20-minute doses, they're seeing up to it adds another sort of 10%. And as you get a halo effect, you get that benefit afterwards. So we're seeing a lot of sort of residual benefits as well in downregulation and other kinds of approaches, mindfulness and things like that.
But Bashar, how about for you, when you talk about an implant like this that can last several months? I think it can have a benefit for some time. How do you, where do you go with this? How do you go about getting it approved or getting insurers and hospitals interested? How do you approach it?
Yeah, so right now, Probufene is approved for opioid use disorder, and we're going through the trials, or beginning the trials for both that and our weekly and monthly injectable formulations. We do the typical pain studies that are required by the FDA, and we anticipate that the benefit would be you have something that's giving you kind of a steady level, blood level, so you don't have this issue of, oh my God, my blood level is dropping, I'm going to get pain, and then you have this kind of anticipatory pain that adds to the whole cycle of pain. And we're also hoping that you can interrupt the transition of acute to chronic pain. That's where a lot of people get into trouble. They have an injury and it's not treated optimally. And believe it or not, most people won't even, none of us are really great at taking medicine that we're supposed to. So I'm supposed to take it every 6 hours, but that's okay. Let me see if I can stretch it out. But that doesn't necessarily help people. And then they end up in worse and worse situations where they need more and more just to get the same effect. And then back to the kind of the earlier conversation, the most dangerous place is where people stop using any kind of medicine and then they go back. And whether that's pain meds, opioids, or whether that's heroin because they've been clean and they've been in rehab, they go back and they use the same 5 bags that would barely get them high, and it will get them dead because they have lost tolerance. And that's really, really dangerous and needs to be prevented. And if you have something that is on board all the time, hopefully you're not going to end up in that situation where suddenly you want something.
So, and to be clear, this is to try and treat the addictiveness to the opioid disuse disorder. So it's the addictiveness to the opioid. Does it actually help with pain as well?
Yeah. So buprenorphine is a pretty remarkable molecule. It's been approved for both opioid use disorder and in various formulations for pain. There's an injectable Bupronex in the hospital, and there's a patch, Butrans, and there's now actually an oral one as well. So it's a molecule that's better than a full agonist like an OxyContin because it has a ceiling effect when it comes to respiratory depression. So if you take buprenorphine by itself and as an adult, it doesn't matter how much you take, you're not going to stop breathing, and that's what kills people when they overdose on opioids. So if you have a dose that is given by a physician or a clinician, and therefore people can't mess around with it, you're sure that they're getting the dose that they need, it can actually be effective for pain. And that's what we are hoping to demonstrate in adequate, well-controlled clinical trials that we're working on.
We are almost out of time, but let me just ask the audience here. We talked a lot about opioids and opioids being sort of the main option for most patients with chronic pain. You've heard now about several different new technologies that are coming down. One has already been approved. How confident are you that these could be viable alternatives going forward, just by show of hands? Not a lot of confidence. People still like their opioids. So we probably still have work to do. How about on the panel here? Show of hands. Confidence. I know you guys.
That's why we're up here.
That's why you're up here. Well, look. Thank you very much. It's fascinating. It's optimistic to note there are at least some solutions in the pipeline. So a warm round of applause for our panel. Thank you.